Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here this afternoon. I'm delighted to be here before all of you and to have the opportunity to moderate this session. The topic for this session is not only an interesting point of discussion, but is also extremely relevant in today's environment and an essential tool towards facilitating the ease of doing business in India. In fact, I would like to share with you that Pratibha Jain spoke to me a few days back and asked me to curate a session and to pick my own topic. And this is the topic I picked, and these are the panelists I picked. And I'm happy to be here because this is a topic that is of great interest to me too. Public policy, regulation, and government affairs. Practice is one of the fastest growing practice areas for all accounting, consulting, and law firms in India. In the last decade, we've seen a paradigm shift in the manner in which law firms are increasingly making this an important area of practice. In this form of practice has been in vogue and widely used in the Western world, especially in the United States and in Europe. In India, there is an inherently negative perception that this area of practice is unethical and that it is considered as not being kosher by government and by regulatory bodies. This perception, however, over the last decade or so has changed. And in fact, today it is increasingly becoming an important tool which helps corporates to not only reach out to the regulatory authorities uh, and, and to the decision makers to present their concerns, but also for consulting firms, including law firms, to act as a bridge between businesses operating in challenging sectors in India, on the one hand, and the policymakers and the regulators, not only just at the national level, but also at the state level, on the other hand. India is one of the fastest growing economies with a great thrust from domestic and international private players. The government's focus has been to become an enabler for attracting foreign investment into the country and for its Make in India thrust. To address both these over the last decade, there has been a drive to simplify compliances and, more importantly, to try and retain some level of consistency in policy making so as to make India an attractive business destination. Industry is now seen as an integral stakeholder in framing of policies and statutes in order for businesses to realize their full potential. This has amplified the role of lawyers, advisors, lobbyists, and consultants who offer their services through a soft and sustained approach, becoming the voice for the industry before the policy and lawmakers. Also, with technology and artificial intelligence playing a major role in business, now law and policymakers are placing far greater reliance on industry partners to formulate the most efficient and sustainable regulatory framework to address concerns of new age businesses. In this context, it can be said that today the public policy and regulatory affairs practice in India has become a seamless extension of a law firm's advisory and corporate compliance practice that it offers to its clients. We have today before us panelists who are thought leaders who understand the complex maze of policy, regulations, and compliances that all corporates and especially multinational companies need to deal with as part of the evolution and growth of their businesses in India. With this background, I would now like to introduce the esteemed panelists who are before us today. I'll start with my far left with Rajat Tandon. Rajat is the president of the IVCA, and you all have the resumes of all the panelists, so I'll keep it very brief. Rajat is focused on planning, developing, and implementing IVCA's regulatory advocacy activities. His goal is to effectively influence regulatory outcomes in support of the alternate asset class. Next to him is Anusuya Ray. Anusuya is the Vice President, Corporate Affairs of AB InBev India. Ms. Ray is the Head of Corporate Affairs for AB InBev and leads the company's government affairs, public policy, regulatory affairs, community affairs, and communications practice. She is a focused professional with exceptional leadership skills. Uh, I have next to her Nivedita Mehra. Nivi is a veteran in facilitating the US-India trade and providing a bridge to US corporates doing business in India. Nivi is the managing director of USISPF and leads the forum's operations in India today. She's a lawyer and has spent over a decade, actually a decade and a half now, right? Yeah. Working in the US-India relations in locations ranging from Washington, D.C. to India. I have Ms. Sharmila Barathan, the Government Affairs and Policy Leader, GE South Asia. She has over 25 years of international experience in policy, regulation, and climate change, and has worked in Europe, South Asia, and East Asia, handling business portfolios across diverse sectors such as energy, healthcare, aviation, and transportation for national governments and multilaterals like the United Nations and IPCC. We have Ms. Shweta Rajpal Kohli. She is the Chief Public Officer, Sequoia Capital India and Southeast Asia. Ms. Kohli drives the public policy agenda for the startup ecosystem and venture capital industry. She also advises Sequoia's portfolio companies on regulatory risks and helps them unlock new levels of growth. May I now request each of my panelists to share their experiences over the last many years in the areas of practice that they lead for their company. May I request Rajat to start? Rajat, you want to do it from there? Or?
Yeah, I'll probably do it from there. A little lazy there. Thank you, Shishir. Thank you for the introduction. I thought I'm going to be the last because you said you had already prepared it out and you're going to be speaking most. So just to give a little bit of background, I belong to the IT and telecom world. That's where I've always spent my life. Hardly dealt with any lawyers, only with the tax people. And when we were all discussing about, pricing and import taxations. So that's the stint I had. And then I started working with startups and started something called the 10,000 Startups. And that's where my first brush with the legal community and the lawyers, where we had to get a standard agreement, shareholder agreement between the legal parties as well as the investor and the startup. And I think the journey started from there. I've been with now IVCA for about close to 7.5, 8 years now. The role of IVCA is around, it's the body which is representing all investors in the country. So whether it's a global investor or domestic investor. So all venture capitalists, private equity, real estate, infrastructure investors, LPs, family offices, they look at IVCA as a single point of contact for any primary work around advocacy. That's one stop because two charters which we try and drive is onshoring the offshore. That means the money which is outside, make sure that they are coming into India. I don't know how many of you saw this video which went viral from Mr. Deepak Bagla about the FDI investments in the country. We talked about 93 months, $593 billion. And just to let you know, 53% of that money is from the VCPE world. And out of that, about 90% comes in from the global investors. So there is a lot of work which is required to be done on the policy and advocacy front, a regulatory side, as well as making sure that they are kosher here. And it's like the speed of business for them is pretty fast. Secondly, we try to help build domestic pools of capital so that the Indian community is investing into this asset class. Now, investment as a topic itself is very challenging because it's got its own intricacies. Working with the regulators, and I just to share an experience, the Indian formed funds typically have to register with the SEBI, which is the regulator. And that's the regulator we've been working with as an association, which comprises of more than 300 members and run by really subject matter experts, as well as people like Nishit Bhai, who's been as one of the earliest partners of the association in helping structure what needs to be delivered. So, the recent, I can just let you know, the Mauritius entities, the Cayman entities, etc. With the help of the legal firms, the lawyers, and the policy efforts which have been going from the association along with its members, in Ahmedabad with the Gift City setup, that's probably one of the best setups which has happened in the recent times. Just to share with you the experiences, unlike where it used to take months and you never know sure about the outcome, you put in a problem to the regulator and you can see how effectively they're turning it around. As a matter of fact, there was something which was required on the taxation front just as of last week. Within 48 hours, that was cleared. So, that's the efficiency which we've seen. Also, when working with, the regulators like the SEBI, which is the regulator for the alternate asset class, we have gone, miles. We have an APAC, which is a body, a set of people, group of people, which is chaired by Mr. Narayan Murthy, to look at the issues of the industry. Years ago, I don't remember anything like that this existed. Today, what it means is that the regulator is listening to you. 2 weeks ago, the regulator was out with the members of the association, close to about 600-700 people, and in a very open discussion about the issues and the challenges were being faced around in this ecosystem, and seeking inputs that how this industry, which has in the AIF sector amount which is about 7 lakh crores, how can that be put across to 35 lakh crores? Now that's the discussion a regulator is tabling across with you. He's having discussions which typically used to happen in the corporate world, which was the morning sessions, etc. But that's the breakfast sessions, open house sessions, which were called. I mean, he's taking charge of that and sitting across with you openly and saying, look, I'm happy to listen to you. Come to the government here in the ministry, where the taxation issues come up. Just the budget was presented. There are a few observations from the industry, and that's with the help of the legal firms and the tax firms who put across saying, yep, fair enough, the budget, but there is a tweak over here. We've gone to the government, and believe it or not, the access to them has become so good that we are having meetings after meetings scheduled, whether it's the CBDT or with the CBIC. So what I'm saying is, as you asked, Shishir, in short, the openness to accept opinions and views from the industry have really been really successful for, as far as we can see, for our asset class. And they are always coming back to look at consultative approaches. So it's kind of becoming a two-way street, which the policy makers, the bridge, as you spoke about, and the people who are kind of putting in the money are really feeling the benefits out of it. And I think the industry takes a challenge saying, look, this is going to certainly go up. Yeah.
Thanks, Rajat. Thanks, Shishir. Thanks for the introduction, Shishir, first. So I lead a company called InBev, and most of you would be knowing our brands, which is Budweiser, Corona, Hoegaarden, Stella Artois, and if you are a beer lover, we are the company to go to. So I've been leading policy for a very long time, and with InBev for the last couple of years. And I guess when we say we operate in India, we are actually operating in 29 different states, and which are also 29 different countries, because the excise policies in India were drafted sometime back in 1940s, and since then there has not been any single change in there, with some minor corrections here and there, right? So we work with these sort of policymakers who are still new to the segment called beer, because India has traditionally been a brown spirit country where spirits have always been favored more than beer, which is a low alcoholic beverage. So where we work is largely around the taxation structure, because beer in India is taxed very high compared to the brown spirits. That's because India looks at taxation at volume content of pure liquid And globally, the taxation structure is always around, looking at the strength of alcohol. So to give you an example, so a beer, which is a mild beer, say about those average taxation around beer, the content of alcohol in beer would be about say 3 to 8%, where 3 is mild and 8 is the strong. But whereas when the taxation happens and then everything is looked equally, what happens is that an alcohol spirit, a brown spirit, would have an alcohol percentage of say 48%, but it will be taxed similarly as beer. And in turn, what happens is that our pricing to consumer increases, right? And also, we see increased uses of brown spirits, illicit, and everything. So where we work with the government is on the concept called moderation, where we are constantly telling that government that India is the only place where this differentiation of taxation is there, which is absolutely not favoring a particular category. Because globally, if you look across the countries, say in US, Europe, in any other country, Germany, etc., what happens is that beer is often taxed lower than pure spirits. In India, I think the highest taxation happens in states like Maharashtra, Haryana, etc. West Bengal is perhaps the closest, which has come now to a sort of taxation which is in favor of beer. But so, therefore, we work around a lot of this moderation agenda with the government, where we go to the policymakers, go to the right set of stakeholders within the states to talk about why there should be differentiation, why there should be this moderation agenda, why there should be increased focus on responsible consumption. So that's one. Secondly, what we have also realized over the many years that we have been operating in India, India is very unique in terms of its license and permits and renewals. So every year, even if there is the bottle of Budweiser, which has been in India, say, for the last 50 years, but every year, the licenses have to be renewed, the labels have to be renewed, and I think we end up doing about 100,000 renewals every year, and it's an annual renewal cycle. So every year on the April 1st, our brewery should run, and we start the licensing cycle with the government in the September, October of the previous year. So we are working very closely with both the center as well as in the state, and since alcohol is a state subject, the federal government is not really kind of inclined to take on a state subject. But at the same time, we are working with policy experts, with legal firms, etc., with CII, with FICCI, where we are forming task force and working with them to educate the bureaucrats more, to educate the governments more on these sort of compliance burdens that we have. And the third is where we are focusing a lot on compliance within the excise structure. All of you know about how the alcohol sector operates, so I will not go there. So companies like us are focusing a lot of compliance, in terms of when these license renewal seasons, etc., come up. So that would be it from my side.
Thank you, Anusuya. Thank you, Shishir, and delighted to be here today. This is, of course, a subject very, very close to my heart. As I was just walking in, I overheard somebody make the comment, the Indian market will never really be open for foreign law firms. And it took me back many, many years where it reminded me how obtuse our advocacy as an American organization used to be. I think the journey in the public policy space has come a long way in the last decade, 15, 20 years. I thought for today's discussion, I'll sort of look back and bring you all through the journey of where we find ourselves today, and really how sophisticated, how nuanced, and how deep the advocacy space has become, has grown. On either side, we have colleagues, members who work very, very closely with us. And, I think the acceptability of public policy professionals, just as a profession even, I think even that has come a really long way in the last few years. Just a little bit about the organization I represent. We are a US headquartered organization with very, very deep roots in India. We're bilateral in nature, so what that means is we operate both at a strategic level between the governments. So think about it as when really critical issues occur between two countries, right, between the US and India, we are the main interlocutor when even governments fail to connect with each other. In the US-India relationship in particular, the commercial piece has really been at the heart of it. It continues to be the driver of the relationship, and therefore plays a very, very important role. This voice plays a very important role in ensuring as a non-NATO ally what the positions India is going to take, what US's response is going to be, and then how you create a framework, for the two to work together on a number of issues such as defense, such as critical technologies. And I think COVID has really opened up the reality of how do we secure our supply chains as well. So, a number of strategic issues that fall into really our bucket of engagement. The second piece of really what the organization does is, we represent, of course, American companies investing in India, American companies who are considering investing in India, as well as Indian companies who have a large market in the US. The role we play for these companies is to be a voice with the government on challenges related to investment. But over the years, again, that advocacy has become more knowledge-led. What are best practices if you're looking to deepen corporate bond markets in India, for instance? As we look at a manufacturing environment, collectively, what can we do to ensure that the government's PLI schemes meet the response that they want? So we have a much broader approach now. It's a more knowledge-sharing approach. And I think we've come again, just sort of to my point of 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we would operate with very much 5 business people coming into India, making statements such as it's a terrible environment to do business and we need these changes. I think it's a patient approach with India. There is now an understanding that, everybody's trying to move towards the same goal of an enabling environment, and we're all parties to it. So I think that shift has definitely happened. I think the second shift has happened about the acceptability of, as Shishir mentioned, lobbying was always a bad word here. We've now come to a point where there is acceptability around public policy, acceptability that an organization like even ours, even though we are American-led, can sit in every discussion, in every consultation of the government, and there is no sense of you're not doing this in our interest. That hasn't come without work. So I think that has been a very, very conscious effort that we have made, a very conscious effort to change our means of advocacy to ensure the government that we're working in the interest of both countries. That's something that as an organization we think about every day. We also advise our members. Companies are always looking for here and now, but our advice always will be take a bigger picture, right? We actually had a very interesting conversation with the Foreign Secretary the other day, and the advice he gave was think about, this was to a lot of CEOs, was think like India, right? If you're India right now, what would you like to see? And come to us with thoughts around that. And I think that's really the ethos when you're doing advocacy. Look at it from the government's point of view. What is their objective and how can we further our investment opportunities by looking at it through that lens? And I think companies are now much more engaged in that process. They all have very, very sophisticated teams on the ground now, as compared to earlier where it was probably just the CEO who was representing their interests in the country. And I think that's really helped towards moving this narrative forward. One last point on the legal profession and sort of the intersection where we come in and the legal profession comes in. I think the legal profession is the natural extension of what we do. The sort of knowledge base, the intricacies of laws as they're drafted in India, all that lies really with the colleagues in the legal profession. And the more we collaborate, the more we bring your knowledge to bear with the government. I think that is a natural fit. I think the one big difference that we see is, I'm a non-for-profit. So for me to always go in with the interests of many is always easier than you all going in with your consulting client's interest or your singular private client's interest. And I think that's where there's an opportunity really for us to work together. And that's really the way we work very closely with all the law firms here in India. So let me stop there, and Shishir, I'll come back with more questions.
Yes, of course.
Thanks, Nivi, and thanks, Shishir. My name is Sharmila Barathan. I lead policy and government affairs for GE General Electric in South Asia. I also sit on there. I'm a board member of GE India Industrial. This is my 17th year in the company, and therefore I've seen a lot of monsoons. Along with, so if Nivi's we've known Nivi since her college days, and so if Nivi's got grey hair, I think many of us have had a role to play. All of us who knew her since her college days. So as GE celebrates its 120th anniversary in the country, we've had a larger purpose of innovating technology for improving the lives, the quality of life of people around the world, essentially in two sectors. One is in energy, which is to drive energy transition towards decarbonization, and the second one is the future of smarter and efficient flight. And as you're aware, we won most recently one of the largest deals in engines, aircraft engines, anywhere in the world, one of the largest deals, both with Boeing and Airbus. Now, basically, what that means is from this stems the importance of if you're operating in regulated sectors like energy and aerospace and defense, what it basically means is that the natural thing to have is strong legal and public policy leaders and leadership. About 2 decades ago, or at least 17 years ago, when I joined, there was the relationship between legal and public policy was quite asymmetric. But in the last few years, as India has transformed, so have corporations, to the extent that we've realized the importance of a collaborative and a collective approach to legal and public policy, both internally and externally as you go in front of the government. And that's arising from just the nature of business in India, which is, increased acquisitions, global acquisitions that we've made, which have a large footprint here in India, or divestments in infrastructure space. But most importantly, I'll give one example, which is 2022 has been a historic year for us because we've announced a spin-off into as three companies. We'll have a GE Healthcare. It got listed on NASDAQ earlier this year, and then a GE Energy and another which is GE Aerospace. Despite the global economic outlook, supply chain challenges, inflation, which is the inflationary pressures, which are the highest since you've seen in 1980s, we've actually successfully spun off healthcare and delivered, let me say, creating shareholder value as we speak. And to a large extent, all of this comes because, we've also had an integrated enabling framework of working both legal and public policy, working both internally and externally, as we work through some complex challenges that you've not had before. In the 120 years of GE, this hasn't happened, and you can imagine how complex just the structure becomes. Now, legal can provide you a very good framework on the first layer, which is the spin-off itself. But as Anusuya said, you go to the next layer, which is your infrastructure layer. You've got joint ventures, public-private partnerships, listed entities. They're all housed in one entity as a manufacturing facility. Facility is a consolidated rooftop, and then you have your regulatory approvals all under one entity, and now you're spinning them off. So the complexity, the toughness of the problems are enormous. But the one thing that I have to say is that the transformational journey of how legal and public policy today work in an integrated fashion, both internally in a company and externally with the government, is unprecedented. So I'll stop with that and hand it to Shweta.
Thank you so much, Sharmila. And I think it's been very interesting to hear all the co-panelists. Quick introduction. My name is Shweta Rajpal Kohli, and I lead public policy for Sequoia Capital for India and Southeast Asia. As most of you would know, Sequoia Capital is a venture capital firm, and we invest in tech and tech-led startups. Our history goes back to Silicon Valley about 50 years ago, and we've been very fortunate to have partnered some of the largest tech companies globally, be it Google, Airbnb, WhatsApp, Cisco, name it, and Sequoia would have likely partnered them at some stage. In India, our journey is about 17 years old, and again, we've been very fortunate to have partnered several successful startups here, including many unicorns, and very, very proud of the journey, especially the role that we've played in creating and building the startup ecosystem in India. I'll step back a little and talk, about the public policy profession, as most of my co-panelists have done, and especially share my experience because, I come from a very different background. I'm not a lawyer, unlike most people in public policy. I come from a media background, having spent close to 2 decades in media, including television. And I made a switch to public policy, starting my career at Uber, followed that up with Salesforce and now Sequoia. And I think the one thing I would definitely like to echo is how much public policy as a profession has changed and is respected and has created its own distinct identity now. So traditionally, there were two trends that would happen. Either, as most panelists and Shishir in the beginning mentioned, that, it was seen as almost a dirty word. Engaging with government is not about, doing it in a clean, effective, or in a way which is, I would say, more scientific or data-driven or research-oriented. It was all about, being seen in the corridors of power and it didn't have the kind of respectability one would expect. I think a lot of credit goes to many of the multinational firms and to organizations like USISPF or IVCF that have, created an entire, architecture around how public policy needs to be done. And I think here it's important to draw the distinction between the strengths of legal and public policy and how they collaborate. So the way I see it is, legal as a profession, most often than not, may not be external facing. It's not necessary that people in law firms or GCs of organizations are going and engaging with government every single day. However, a public policy professional's role is exactly that, to take exactly what your legal teams are telling you or what the subject matter knowledge that arises from the legal expertise of people and putting it in a very palatable as well as very easy to digest manner for the policymakers, for the regulators, because I think a public policy person forms that bridge between the organization and the government. A public policy professional is able to understand the pressures of the policymakers and regulators and articulate that back to the company, because as Nivi said, very often we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the government or of the regulators. So when I go back and work with many of our founders, I say, no, it's very important for you to understand that a regulator will always prioritize, for instance, a consumer interest over corporate interests. So how do you create that balance between promoting innovation, promoting corporate goals, and the business interests of the industry versus ensuring that regulators and policymakers are doing what they are entrusted to do, which is their job, which is to make sure that whatever's happening is A, in national interest, B, in the interest of the consumers, and obviously alongside that has to be promoting industry and growth. So I think public policy professionals understand that balance very well and are able to work very creatively with the lawmakers, with policymakers, with regulators to bridge that gap. And I think that's exactly what has brought that respectability to the profession, because how do you do that? Either you engage directly because you have a seat at the table with the government, or you engage through very, very respected industry bodies like IVCA, like USISPF, and put your point across as an industry stakeholder. So I think those are the two ways you do it. You do it with think tanks as well, where you have what we call data-driven policy making, where you have to make compelling arguments. It's no longer about relationships and access. While that's important, and that's an important role that public policy plays, what's even more important is how compelling your arguments are. And I'll cite two very quick examples of huge success we've seen of public policy and how you work closely with the legal profession. I think, Nivi, you've been close to this situation, and I'll cite two of the ones that I work very closely with. With Nivedita and team, we worked on the data protection bill. So India's GDPR, so to say. And I think that is so heavily legal-oriented conversation. It is, at the end of the day, a new law for India for privacy. But the ones who did the front-facing with the government were actually public policy professionals. All of us who sat for years to debate with government what that ideal piece of legislation needs to look like. And I think why I call that a success story, because we had the government listening. And the fact that, we could bring about those necessary changes, we could have an entire earlier draft redrawn and back to the table was the effort of years and years of public policy, because this is a long game. This is not something you fix overnight. So I think that's one huge success story of how legal and public policy work together to achieve an effective outcome. I think the second one I want to cite is where we work closely with IVCA, for instance, on the regulatory front. Very recently, through IVCA, the venture capital industry was able to engage with the current insurance regulator, IRDA. And over many, many meetings that happened, we actually got a very, very progressive regulation around the PVC industry and what regulations in the insurance sector need to look like. So I think classic examples of that collaboration that we're seeing between legal and policy. I can go on and on about how the startup ecosystem is shaping up, because what I find fascinating, at least about my role before I hand it over to Shishir, is that it allows me a ringside view of what's going on in the startup ecosystem. So one day you're looking at health tech, another day gaming, and then crypto, and then fintech and edtech. And across the board, we work very, very closely with founders and help educate them on how the government works, because it's very important for them to understand that ultimately they will be large enough and they will have public policy work to be done. I'll pause there, Shishir.
Great. Just borrow this. Thank you, co-panelists. Let me start with Anusuya. And, I had penned down a couple of very tricky questions for you, but I'll start with a very easy one. When are we going to get decent alcohol in Delhi? How are you dealing with the excise policy issue? And what has your experience been over the last 5-6 months? And what you think is the way forward?
Shishir, I told you not to ask me these tricky questions beforehand only. But I guess, Delhi policy has been rather, tough for every player which is there in the market. And it started with a very noble note on, having a private sort of a market. We're back to the corporation model. We're all working with the excise, the new excise, I would say the bureaucrats were there, and to understand how the policy will evolve. So currently it's a sub judice matter, so I would not be commenting much on that one. But I would say, the market's tough, but we are trying to supply whatever we are being allowed to supply. Yeah.
Thank you. One thing that Shweta briefly touched upon, and I think it's, a very critical aspect of, the public policy, government affairs and regulatory practice that we are looking at today, and that we as advisors, provide to our clients. And that critical aspect, one aspect that we all focus on a lot is about how to change the mindset of the government, and how 15, 20 years back, things were a little different. Rajat touched upon it, that today it's a little more easier to deal with them, and they understand what you're saying. That is one very important aspect. But I think the other critical aspect of, providing this, practice area and support to clients across different sectors. And there I would want the thoughts of Rajat and Nivi, because, you have stakeholders that you deal with on a day-to-day basis in different industries. How has the mindset of your members and your stakeholders changed towards the government and towards issues that the government raises from time to time, and how that change of mindset probably is also, the reason why you see a different approach from government and regulatory bodies today.
Shishir, as we all know, change is the only constant. And I think for us as well, at the industry level, you need that patience, which is so very important.
Right.
Things cannot be done overnight, because the government has to look at not just one asset class,
Right.
but multiple asset class. Also with the frequent changes, people retire, people go, somebody new comes in. So the role of the association and the members, as opportunities become very different, is to educate. That's one of the most important roles.
And on both sides.
And it's really on both sides because, like Shweta said, very importantly, we need to understand them as well, right, from where they are coming from. There's a perspective which they have. And as Shweta was mentioning, that she always talks to the startups, that this is the intent of the government. I think that similarly in the industry as well. Well, that's typically our intent. And I'm sure we are all discussing, the valuations which are being talked about, and aspects of governance which have become so important in this environment. So, and that's where professionally documented, legal advice, a good practice always comes to play.
Right. Nivi, from 2000, 2001 to now, what is the change you see in the clients you represent? And a large part of them are American corporates who are looking to or are already in India, right?
So I think just to echo, I think what Rajat said, I think the patience, for India has gone up a lot. So definitely people understand that it's a complicated market. And, once you enter the market, there will be challenges at all kinds of different levels. So, that basic understanding is a lot better now, as big companies look at India. I think the second is they have also now started to appreciate the value of Indian partners much more. So we see the local JVs, the local partnerships, all that also deepen. I think also as we look at the global environment, the sort of sentiment across the world of everybody trying to manufacture in your own country, localize a lot more. I think there's an understanding that India is going to be a very, very large market. There's no denying that. And having a footprint here for the long term is important. So, some of it is also external factors in the rise of India. So I would definitely
Right.
not discount that, as to why people are more patient or picking up on this opportunity.
Right. Excellent. So, Shweta, you work with a lot of startups, and as part of that support that you provide to your client, how difficult is it, and what is your experience in inculcating, the habit of putting together strict compliances, adhering to the regulatory framework when you invest in a startup, and from there to sort of making sure that the startup is up to speed with the kind of, or the levels of compliance and regulatory, bookkeeping that you think you would need?
Sure, Shishir. So I wouldn't necessarily term our startups or founders as clients, but they are partners really. Because when we, as a venture capital firm, invest in a startup, that's when the journey of company building begins. And we believe that it's not just about funding or cutting a check. It's all about supporting them in building long-term, enduring companies. And I think part of that is to also ensure that these companies are working within the four corners of law, are following, the best regulatory practices, compliances. But I think what's interesting and fascinating for me has been educating the startup ecosystem around how to set up the public policy practice and at what stage of their journey would they need it. Maybe a seed stage company, early stage company, too soon for them to start thinking about engaging with government. They're still in the company building mode. They're still figuring out their product market fit. They're still figuring out, the basics of company building. But I think one thing that I often advise founders is that sooner rather than later, either the sector that they're possibly disrupting or creating, or the sector they're a part of will be so large that they will face some need for public policy. Now, that could come in the form of incumbents. Traditionally, most sectors, as you would see, that are tech-led will have incumbents, creating that noise to ensure that, the new age tech companies are not taking away a large part of their pie. So, either the pressure would come on part of incumbents, or they'll be part of an industry where there will be natural friction. So, if you're a consumer-facing industry, you could face consumer challenges. And, those then bring you within the ambit of regulations. And I think at that stage, it's very important And the one message that I gave is, of course, how do you structure that public policy practice? Is it going to sit under legal? Is it going to be a separate practice? And I think that varies from sector to sector. Right. There are sectors where public policy is more around creating nice public policy programs, engaging with government, and where it isn't heavy on legal, for instance. It's more about thought leadership. It's more about, your presence in government. There are some sectors, depending on how heavy they are on regulatory, where it's very, very interlinked with legal, because it's existential. Like, overnight, a regulatory change can shut you down, or a positive regulatory change can give you the necessary, legality, or I would say, make your business kosher. So I think it varies from startup to startup, from what stage they are in. So I think a lot of that is this kind of advisory that I give. But I think the most important advice I feel that we like to give startups, or at least I like to say, is fight your battles in the marketplace. But in the policy ecosystem, it's very important that you come across as one voice, which is why I always say that my role is not to be a public policy person for our portfolio companies. Although, of course, we're seen as a trusted advisor to government because we go as an industry, voice, and not self-serving as one company. But I say, you know what? I want to be able to be the voice of the entire sector and not be seen as self-serving for only our portfolio companies, because the only way you can build that trust with government is if you're going and doing what's right for the ecosystem, what's right for startups as a whole. And I think that's worked very well, because there are times we're sitting across the table with our portfolio as well as with competing companies in the portfolio, but working together and bringing them on the table to work jointly for achieving an outcome which will be desirable for the entire sector. And I think that's the kind of maturity we expect that, startups will reach, where it's not about them, but it's about what's right for the entire sector.
Sharmila, you talked about a couple of areas where, GE has faced challenges and how you've dealt with those over a period of time. But I think, what would be interesting is to know what your experience has been over the last 3 to 3.5 years, during the COVID period. Are there any critical issues that have come up for GE as a business in India and operating in India, and how you've been able to sort of navigate through that issue or problem during the COVID period? And second, and just as an add-on to that, have you seen any change in the manner in which your external advisors have advised you and helped you during this period?
So thanks, Shishir. Yes, I think COVID was one of those where a GE healthcare was challenged across the world. So, for example, there are two things that happen out of India for us. One is, of course, we have a very huge manufacturing ecosystem for the globe that happens out of India, and India has always encouraged that. Now, so once the investment flows in, and at one point you close the tap and you say, you know what, I won't allow you to export components for ventilators that go out of facilities here now, that becomes unacceptable then at some point. Because everyone said, we always thought of you as part of a global ecosystem. So we had to fight that battle to say that, here we've set up a manufacturing facility where you've moved global supply chains to India, and then you'll have to explain to within the company, what does resilience then mean for the company now? Let's not worry about anywhere else. So that's one. I have to say it was a tough one even for the government, and that's where, where Shweta said, I think one of your core competencies for the public policy professional becomes empathy. Put yourself in the position of the government of India, where they have 1 billion people that they have to deal with, which is not equivalent to anywhere in the world. What will happen? So anyway, so we found ways in which, there are some components that can go out and where ventilators can be manufactured, and then eventually they come back to India as well and all that. So some of those happened. And then the other one where I thought the government was extraordinarily helpful, and this is to one of the state governments. I mean, we work with 20 state governments and 5 out of the 9 union territories. So for us, it's a humongous task just running a public policy practice for the entire group of companies that we have in India. Now, what happened was during that phase, they had they disallowed oxygen supply to anywhere other than hospitals, the right thing to do. What they did not recognize was that manufacturing facilities like ours, again, GE Healthcare, which manufacture x rays and all, they also need oxygen to produce that equipment for their x ray tubes, and that goes into CT machines as well. And so, when your CT machine fails, and if one of the things is the tube, then we are not able to supply because we're going to also stop running our factories. So then I had to go back to, which is in this case the Karnataka government, and they were very good. What they said was, up to a point where they felt there was a peak in hospitalization, they said you'll have to manage with what you have. And just immediately after that oxygen train arrived, the first cylinder or whatever they gave to us, only so that our supply chain can continue. So there's business continuity on that front, only because it's a cycle, because it comes back to helping hospitals and taking care of COVID patients. So again, going back to what a lot of people said, including Shweta, which is, I think one of the competencies one needs as public policy professional is empathy, and to go back and close the loop with your own people. The second one is also to be able to be innovative in providing proposals to the government that is enabling, which is win-win for both parties. I think that is also a key thing. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sharmila. Before we sort of open this to the audience for any questions, one last question to Nivi. And more than a question, just your thoughts on, one aspect where you and I both have worked together quite a bit, but some years back, and how that whole, issue has changed from when you were looking at bringing foreign law firms into India to today, where most foreign law firms actually don't want to come to India. They're happy with status quo. What has your experience been, around that?
So it's a very interesting question, because when it was a top priority for us, and we actually saw foreign law firms very, very eager. This is about 15 years ago, wanting, as their top priority to enter the Indian market. Since then, Shishir, what we find is everybody has found a happy medium of partnerships. I think the Indian law firms have also grown. Not only the large ones, of course, have grown in size, but we've got a lot of smaller boutique firms that have come up to fill that gap and actually serve as very, very good partners to the foreign law firms. I think the second area that we've seen, and this is to speak to the consulting firms, we have a whole slew of Washington DC practices actually now in India which are offering public policy services. So that's an area, and we have some homegrown Indian firms as well, but that's an area we're seeing a lot of growth. But specifically on the law firms, where I would sort of rest my case is, I think there's been a very good opportunity for everybody to sort of collaborate and grow together, and sometimes taking on very, very key issues like this in a moment in time. When you look back after a period, you realize that, sometimes you have to also go with the flow of the market. And I think that was a very key learning. Just on Sharmila's point, actually, I just wanted to bring up one more thing, which I think we didn't talk about today, was while the government is very open, engaged, and I gave the advice that we should always put ourselves in their shoes, I would be remiss not to say that there are times when we also have to be ready to have very difficult conversations with the government.
Right.
So we're not in a period where you'll hear a company say, I'll leave India if you don't do this. But that being said, the government also, policy predictability remains a big challenge. Tax remains a critical challenge for most MNCs in India. So there is enough and more where the red carpet will be laid out and then pulled back equally quickly. So, a little more maturity has to still come in this area. There is still some work to be done. And, I think as public policy professionals, the ability to go in and have those frank conversations is equally important. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing our job. So, yeah.
We have a few minutes for any questions, that anyone has for the panelists. Need a mic there.
I can just speak.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I'm Krishna Gandhi. Thank you so much for your time. My interest here is in the Indian exercise. As an Indian lawyer, also qualified in this, advise a lot of Indian clients, especially in the MSME sector, or in the startups. When we talk about being in the position of suppliers of goods or services to Indian companies, a lot of times during contract negotiations, the scope of negotiation of dispute resolution policies is quite limited when it comes to MSME companies or even startups, because our positions of leverage are quite limited as you understand. As policy professionals, while all greatly appreciate all the efforts that are being done by all of you to make India a destination and make ease of doing business within India, that's a commendable exercise. But what are we doing as policy professionals to make ease of doing business by Indian companies when it comes to interactions with these American or European companies, for example, better, especially in terms of dispute resolution, because we see dispute resolution, the forums and venues, be it in arbitration or be it in regular civil litigation, if it happens to be in America, it is priced out of scope for 99% of the MSMEs and startups. It's a non-starter environment. So, what is your opinion as policy professionals? What should we do better to make this easier for the Indian suppliers of goods and services?
I think that's exactly where the likes of USI, SPF, and other industry bodies come in. And I think that clearly answers the role that, say, an industry body would play in situations like these. And that's the reason why they exist, to form that bridge between what are the concerns of the industry, as well as, take those concerns to governments on both sides. So Nivi can speak to this better, but I can, for instance, explain that, whenever there are concerns, whether it's dispute resolution or it's advocacy or it is, regulatory, legal, whatever changes are required, there are industry bodies that will work to address issues in a particular country. And those are industry bodies that are, typically called the, chambers of association or whatever, like the FICCIs and the CIIs of the world, right? That's to deal with domestic issues of domestic industry. And then there are bilateral industry bodies like the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, which essentially aims to create that bridge, between industry and government, but between the two bilateral governments, and that's how they operate. And I think, while I would not go into specifics of MSMEs or the dispute resolution process, there are times when even industry bodies engage with each other. So if there is an industry body that represents the interests of MSME and has to work closely with, say, a USI, SPF to take that at a dispute resolution level with the US, I think those are channels that are created and how partnerships happen where you can work together to solve for those. But to your point, just to sum up, the right channel is to have that go-between, that in-between, which is in the form of someone who can take that concern forward.
I'll just add, Shweta, sorry. I think to Shweta's point, the collective is very important, right? And with MSMEs, we don't see that voice coming through. So, there could be one aggrieved party, two aggrieved party, but as a collective, right, the issues are never really represented in a way where it has caused enough engagement around it. So, my advice would also be that, if some of these issues, and MSMEs definitely would need to band together rather than have it represented as a singular issue, because that really won't allow us to even push it forward.
But it's part of the policy professionals' job, those who are operating in India, also to create these so-called bilateral questions back to the countries of origin where all of this is coming from.
Correct. But if we have enough cases or volume, or if it's brought to our notice, right? Again, you can serve as many members, right? But we're all structured on membership models. And unless somebody is bringing these cases to us, also it's not possible for us to know about it. So I think the part about awareness is very important, right? And maybe the MSMEs also don't know that there is a forum where they can go with such grievances, where we could potentially try to support them. So I think that gap is definitely there for MSMEs. It's not a population we engage with as much as we probably should.
So one last question, if there is any. No, I think that's it. Thank you all. Thank you so much, and thank you for the audience for giving us a patient hearing. Thank you, everyone.